Bullies mocked a disabled veteran. 30 minutes later, her Marine brothers gave the answer. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The morning light filtered softly through the greasy windows of Montana Grill, tinting the Formica tabletops a golden hue. It was the kind of small-town diner where regulars didn't need menus, and conversations were spoken with nods and half-smiles. But on that Thursday morning, beneath the hum of the overhead fluorescents and the hiss of eggs on the griddle, something colder simmered just beneath the surface. Grace Donovan wheeled herself to the corner booth, as she did every shift. The rhythm of repetition had long since replaced the unpredictability of combat. The tight curve she maneuvered around the crowded tables, the way she adjusted her balance as she reached for stacked coffee mugs, all spoke of muscle memory carved from necessity. Her Marine Corps pin, worn and nearly dull, was affixed to her shirt collar, not for show, but as a quiet reminder of who she had once been, who she still was. At 48, Grace carried more than the visible loss of her left leg. Her eyes, framed by time and fatigue, spoke of years most people never saw. There was no pride in her limp salute to civilian life, just a need to stay afloat. The bell above the door jangled sharply. Heads turned. For men swaggered in, their boots heavy with alcohol and entitlement. Brent Callahan led them, barrel-chested, sunburnt, and loud. He was known around town, dishonorably discharged, bitter, and mean in the way only the disappointed can be. Grace instinctively stiffened. She kept her eyes on the coffee pot she was filling. "Well, look what we got here," Brent's voice boomed across the diner. Half a Marine and twice the attitude. The clatter of cutlery stopped. Conversations froze. A couple seated by the window glanced over before lowering their eyes to their breakfast plates. The manager, Rick, stayed behind the counter, watching silently. Grace didn't respond. She wheeled herself forward and began collecting empty dishes. "Hey, Wheels," Brent laughed, nudging his buddy. "You sure you should be serving food? Pretty sure that stump of yours violates some kind of health code." Grace focused on balancing the dishes. Her knuckles whitened, but her voice stayed even. "Can I get you gentlemen some coffee?" Brent leaned in. "Why not? But only if it comes with a war story. Maybe how you lost that leg. Tripped on your shoelaces?" His friends erupted in laughter. Grace turned without a word, wheeling away. "Guess they let anyone join now," Brent muttered. "Quotas and pity medals." Grace kept her back straight. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the fresh pot of coffee. She didn't see Brent rise. A sudden shove. Her wheelchair lurched. Grace crashed to the floor with a thud that echoed louder than it should have. Dishes shattered. A coffee mug spun in lazy circles before tipping. Her purse spilled across the floor, scattering a folded photo, a military ID card, and a purple heart in its protective case. The diner went silent. Not a single person moved. Brent chuckled. "Guess they don't teach balance in the Marines." Grace lay still for a second, stunned more by the silence than the fall. The tile was cold against her hands. The ache in her shoulder screamed. But the greater pain was something deeper, older. She had faced insurgents in Kabul, gunfire in Helmand. But nothing compared to the humiliation of being ignored in her own country. She reached for her wheelchair. No one helped. The young waitress, Melissa, took a hesitant step before Rick shot her a warning glance. "Don't," he muttered. "They drink big and tip well. Not worth the trouble." Grace grunted as she righted the chair. She pulled herself up, arms shaking with effort. With slow, deliberate motions, she gathered her scattered belongings. The photo was slightly torn now. The edges of the purple heart case were cracked. She wiped it with her sleeve. Across the room, a boy of no more than 8 stared at her wide-eyed. He tugged his father's arm. "Dad, is she a real soldier? Like you?" The father, wearing a Vietnam veteran cap, glanced from Grace to Brent. "Yes, son," he said quietly. "She is." He stood slowly, anger simmering in his eyes. Pulled out his phone. Walked out the door. Grace didn't know it yet, but that call would ripple across state lines. That humiliation would not be the end. It would be the beginning of something no one in that diner expected. Outside, Montana Grill, the sunset cast its golden light across the distant mountains. But inside, a quiet storm had just passed. Not with words, but with cruelty, humiliation, and cold indifference. Grace Donovan, a former Marine, lay silently beside her overturned wheelchair, her uniform stained with hot coffee and shame. A few tables away, an 8-year-old boy trembled at the sight. His father, wearing a Gulf War veteran's jacket, gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Stay here," he whispered, then pulled out his phone. "It's Crawford," he said, his voice low and firm. "I need to rally the old unit. We've got a situation that can't wait." 30 minutes later, under the pale lights of the restaurant parking lot, a desert camouflage Humvee rolled in, its tires crunching the gravel. The restaurant's usual hum fell silent. The vehicle stopped right in front of the main entrance. 3 Marines stepped out in full dress uniform. Leading the way was Master Sergeant Richard Wilson, tall, gray-haired, limping slightly, his eyes forged in steel. At his side walked a female captain with gleaming insignia and a young private pushing an empty wheelchair. No one said a word. They moved through the restaurant with the precision of a battlefield march. Patrons who had been murmuring into their coffee cups now fell completely silent. The room was filled with a tense stillness. Grace remained in the back corner, her expression unreadable, but her hands clenched tightly. When she saw them, she stiffened, eyes wide with a mix of surprise and gratitude. Master Sergeant Wilson stopped in front of her and stood at attention. Then, in a clear, commanding voice, he saluted. "Staff Sergeant Donovan," he said, "I apologize for the delay. Marines never leave one of their own behind." Grace hesitated for a moment before raising her hand in return, a salute still crisp, still sharp, as if no time had passed. The air in the room seemed to crackle. A spark had been reignited. Wilson turned to the patrons, his gaze locking onto Brent Callahan, the man who had humiliated Grace. "We were informed that a Marine veteran was insulted and assaulted on American soil. Not by an enemy, but by her own people. That is unacceptable." The silence shifted from stunned to solemn. An elderly man wearing a Korean War veteran cap stood up, chest out, hand over heart. A woman with an Air Force pin nodded quietly. Then, as if by some unspoken command, people across the restaurant, young and old, military and civilian, rose to their feet. They didn't speak. They simply stood, eyes on Grace. Brent Callahan lowered his head, avoiding their gaze, fingers gripping his cold glass. The female captain beside Wilson stepped forward. "Staff Sergeant Donovan is more than a veteran. She led her unit through Helmand Province when every supply line was cut. She rescued 3 Afghan children from a burning vehicle after an IED blast. She lost part of her body, but never her dignity." Grace shook her head gently. "You don't need to say all that. I didn't do it for recognition." "No," Wilson replied, "but we say it so no one forgets that honor is never truly lost, only misplaced for a time." At the bar, manager Dave stepped forward, head low. I'm sorry, MS. Donovan, I was wrong not to stand up for you." The young private rolled the wheelchair up beside Grace's table. "We're here to take you home, but if you want to stay, we'll stay with you." Grace looked around at the familiar and unfamiliar faces surrounding her. The little boy raised a shy salute. His father gave a quiet nod. Grace straightened her jacket, picked up her cold coffee, and took a slow breath. "I'm staying. I haven't finished my coffee." In that moment, the room filled with quiet smiles. There were no claps, no speeches, just a truth made visible. Honor had been restored. And the Marine, though seated in a wheelchair, stood tall in the hearts of everyone present. Inside Montana Grill, the air seemed to stand still. Grace Donovan remained seated at the corner table. Her posture was steady, her gaze fixed, silent and strong, like a bronze statue, resilient, yet alone. Dried coffee stained her pant leg. Fresh scrapes marked the artificial knee of her prosthetic, all telling the story of a battle just fought. Not in a war zone, but here on American soil, in a place that was supposed to be safe. Beside her stood Master Sergeant Richard Wilson, upright like a flagpole, eyes locked on her without wavering. Behind him, Corporal Michael Jenkins, now in full dress uniform, stepped forward, his eyes glimmering with gratitude. "Staff Sergeant Donovan," Jenkins said, voice clear and full of emotion. "In 2010, in Kandahar, you pulled me out from the wreckage of a burning Humvee. I still remember the blast, the dust, the chaos, and your arms holding on to me. Your blood was all over my face. I'm alive because of you, and I've never forgotten." Grace looked up, surprise and recognition flashing in her eyes. She remembered him, the fresh-faced private who had once looked too young to carry a rifle. Now a strong, steady man in uniform, standing tall, because he was still standing at all. "I thought you didn't make it," she whispered. Jenkins gave a small smile. "I almost didn't, but I'm here because of you. And today, I'm here to return a part of the honor that never should have been taken from you." The restaurant fell into reverent silence. Captain Elena Rodriguez, the young female officer standing behind them, stepped forward, her eyes sweeping across the room, locking onto every diner now frozen in silence. "Grace Donovan is not a disabled waitress," she said firmly, her voice sharp and unwavering. "She is a staff sergeant of the United States Marine Corps. She kept her oath, even after the world forgot her." Then Captain Rodriguez placed her hand on Grace's shoulder, a gesture both formal and profoundly human. "Semper Fidelis," she said. "It's not just a motto. It's a lifetime promise. And we do not leave our own behind." Customers began to rise. An elderly man in a World War II veteran's cap stood and saluted. A middle-aged couple wearing Air Force pins placed their hands over their hearts. A group of off-duty Army reservists in civilian clothes rose from their table. The entire room was still. Only the sound of chairs moving and footsteps soft with respect filled the space. Even the regular customers, those who had never served, stood, out of compassion, out of conscience, because they saw something greater than just a moment of violence in a diner. Brent Callahan, the man who just 30 minutes earlier had mocked, shoved, and humiliated a veteran, now couldn't lift his head. As he looked around, he saw only silent condemnation. No one laughed. No one defended him. Jenkins stepped closer, saluted Grace, and spoke again. "You once told us something back when everything was collapsing in dust and blood. You said, a soldier doesn't stand for themselves. They stand for the person beside them. Today, you don't have to stand. We're standing for you." Grace's chest tightened. She had never cried on the battlefield. But now, in her homeland, surrounded by those who knew her name, who called her by rank, and who looked at her with respect, her throat closed. Something inside her, long thought dead, was quietly coming back to life. She gripped the edge of the table, grounding herself. But for the first time in years, she didn't feel alone. Master Sergeant Wilson bent down and placed a newly issued military ID card on the table, restored from archived service records. "We've contacted the Department of Defense," he said. "Your service history is being updated, and we're not stopping until every part of your honor is restored." Captain Rodriguez added, "And by the way, the Diner of the Brave has just been designated the local meeting spot for veterans in this region. Thanks to someone like you, we have a reason to come back." The room seemed to brighten. There was no applause, no national anthem, just presence, genuine and powerful, calling back a dignity that had once been buried. Grace Donovan, former United States Marine, once mocked with sneers and dismissed with contempt, was now honored with silence, with stillness, with respect. She didn't say a word. She simply placed her hand gently over the new ID card and gave a slow, deliberate nod. But everyone in the room understood. She had just been called by name, not just by her fellow Marines, but by a society that had finally opened its eyes and was learning once again what honor truly means. 1 week after the incident at Montana Grill shook the town, the old sign was taken down. In its place hung a new hand-painted board in solemn red and white, Diner of the Brave. No longer just a quiet restaurant filled with sidelong glances, the place had become a sanctuary of respect, a gathering point for veterans across the region. The left-hand wall was now paneled in oak, covered with a mix of black and white and vibrant portraits of local vets, some from Vietnam, others from Iraq, and even a few fresh from recent deployments. Beneath each photo were names, ranks, and years of service. A reminder that behind every face was a story worth honoring. A small chalkboard sign at the register read, in white script, "Veterans eat free every last Friday of the month. Thank you for your service." Grace Donovan no longer sat quietly in the back corner. Her usual table, where everything had once fallen apart, now bore a brass plaque, reserved for Staff Sergeant G. Donovan, USMC. Semper Fi. No one touched that table unless invited by Grace herself. Every Thursday at exactly 1800 hours, an old but well-maintained Humvee rolled up in front of the diner. Out stepped Master Sergeant Richard Wilson, Captain Elena Rodriguez, and Corporal Jenkins, always in uniform, each carrying their own coffee mug like part of an unspoken ritual. They sat with Grace as if they'd never left the battlefield. Words were few, sometimes just a nod, other times a quiet laugh shared over memories. Kandahar, Fallujah, sandstorms, cold nights without light. Their presence began to shift the atmosphere. Patrons who had once looked away when Grace was humiliated now glanced her way with quiet remorse and newfound respect. Young people from neighboring towns lingered longer, drawn to the stories at Grace's table, not about violent battles, but about discipline, duty, and unseen sacrifice. Dave, the manager who once stopped Melissa from helping Grace, now wore a tucked-in shirt and a small American flag pin on his chest. He was the first to hang a photo on the Wall of Honor. He redesigned the menu, adding a special, Donovan's Determination, meatloaf with extra strength. Melissa, the young server once told to stand down, was now the assistant manager. She had learned to recognize rank insignias, to understand why veterans move and speak with such precision, and, most importantly, she had learned never to turn her back on injustice. Grace had taught her that, not through lectures, but through presence. A little boy named Tommy, the first to ask his father about Grace on the day of the attack, now brought crayon drawings every week. MS. Grace with the flag. MS. Grace helping a new guy. And MS. Grace smiling. On one, he'd printed in bold letters, "Real heroes have wheels." One autumn morning, Grace arrived early as usual. A crisp wind slipped in through the window. She spotted a young soldier outside the door, hesitating. He was in new dress uniform, his face uncertain, new in town, knowing no one, clutching his cap like he was still standing at attention. Grace quietly rolled toward the door, her voice calm. "First deployment?" He nodded. "Afghanistan, ma'am. Shipping out Monday." "Come on in," Grace smiled. "That table over there's got a spot open. The coffee's a little bitter, but the company's solid." He took a seat and was welcomed by Master Sergeant Wilson's steady gaze, a gentle question from Captain Rodriguez, and a firm shoulder tap from Corporal Jenkins. For the first time since she was shoved to the floor, Grace's eyes held no trace of caution. Instead, there was a rare peace, as if finally she was home. That small community was no longer indifferent. It had awakened. It didn't take a revolution, just one person willing to stand up, and others who refused to look away. Autumn arrived slowly in Montana, as if the leaves themselves were learning how to let go gently. In the soft golden light of a late afternoon, Grace Donovan sat at a small desk in her modest apartment, carefully turning over a formal invitation. Clearwater High School cordially invites Staff Sergeant Grace Donovan, guest speaker at the Junior ROTC induction ceremony. She smoothed the corner of the paper, her fingers brushing over the title Staff Sergeant, as if unsure whether that name still belonged to her. But it did. It was coming back. The next morning, Grace arrived at the school in full dress uniform, not out of obligation, but as a message to the younger generation. We don't lose honor. Sometimes the world just forgets to see it. The auditorium fell silent as she wheeled herself to the podium. No one noticed the prosthetic leg beneath her pants. No one heard the soft hum of wheels under the thick carpet. Only her voice, calm and steady, filled the room. "I lost part of my body in Afghanistan. But the hardest part was coming home and feeling like I was no longer seen as a person. I'm not here today to talk about war. I'm here to talk about resilience." She spoke of pulling a fellow Marine from gunfire despite searing pain, of the lonely nights after returning home, and finally, of the moment she was called by name again in a small-town diner. Each word moved like an underground current, winding its way into the hearts of every listener. Dignity doesn't live in what we wear or where we are. It lives in how we face the worst and still hold on to the best parts of ourselves. When she finished, the entire auditorium rose in applause. Not for a war hero, but for a human being, brave, honest, and deeply inspiring. That afternoon at Montana Grill, now Diner the Brave, Grace showed Melissa how to recognize military ranks on uniforms. The young woman listened closely, notebook in hand, laughing when she confused a master sergeant with a gunnery sergeant. I used to think soldiers were cold and distant, Melissa admitted. We just learn to be quieter than most, Grace replied. Doesn't mean we don't feel. A conversation between two generations, one who had faced battle, the other just starting life, became the shortest bridge to deliver the most lasting message, that empathy and respect are never out of date. A week later, a young soldier walked into the diner, about to leave home for his first training deployment. Nervous, uncertain, his eyes scanned the room for a sense of safety. Grace saw a reflection of her younger self in his gaze. She invited him to sit, poured him a cup of black coffee, and asked softly, "What are you most afraid of?" He hesitated, then whispered, "I'm afraid I won't be strong enough." Grace was quiet for a moment, then said, "Strength isn't always about carrying a rifle or climbing a hill. Sometimes it's standing back up after you've been knocked down, and still looking the one who pushed you in the eye." She told him about the day her old unit rolled back into the diner, how the entire room stood, unprompted, simply because a Marine in a wheelchair was sitting in the corner. Because you never fight alone, even when it feels like no one remembers. When a young soldier left, he handed Grace an old name tag. "Hold on to it for me," he said, "to remind me to come back worthy." Grace held the tag in her hand, her fingers trembling, not from weakness, but from emotion. Night fell. The diner was nearly empty, but one light still glowed in the corner, above the small brass plaque that read, "Staff Sergeant Grace Donovan, Semper Fi." Melissa set a cup of hot tea down at the table. "Do you think the world's getting better, MS?" "Grace?" she asked. Grace smiled. Outside the window, the first snowflakes began to fall. One person at a time. One kind gesture. One quiet listener. That's how the world heals. Not with noise. Just with honesty. Montana Grill, now known as Diner the Brave, welcomed a radiant autumn morning. A crisp chill swept past the window panes, casting soft sunlight on the wall of veteran portraits, a wall of honor inspired by Grace Donovan herself. At the familiar corner table near the window, where the morning light always landed, a new brass plaque had just been mounted. Etched into it were simple but powerful words, reserved for those who never back down. Grace sat there, her warm Marine Corps jacket draped over her shoulders, a warm cup of coffee in hand. Her eyes were distant, yet peaceful. She was no longer the woman shoved to the floor in silence, no longer the quiet figure hidden behind the kitchen. Now, she was a living symbol, not for flashy heroics, but for the quiet resilience that had shifted an entire community's way of seeing. Each week, veterans came not just for a free meal, but to see themselves in Grace's story. They sat a little taller, spoke a little freer, and shook hands with a sense of shared understanding. Those who once buried their military past now proudly wore old caps again, pinned forgotten badges to their jackets, as if reclaiming a part of themselves. Dave, the manager who had once turned away during that dark day, now greeted every guest with a firm nod. He raised the flag each morning and was always the first to stand when a veteran entered. "Grace," he said one morning, gently placing a bouquet of white chrysanthemums next to the brass plaque. "Thank you for reminding us of the most important thing. Respect can't be demanded. It has to be given." On Saturday mornings, the usual crew arrived like clockwork. Master Sergeant Wilson, Captain Rodriguez, and Corporal Jenkins. They didn't speak much. They simply drank their coffee, exchanged glances, and sometimes chuckled over an old war story. In that silence was a bond deeper than words, proven, not proclaimed. That day, a young man in a crisp, new uniform stepped inside. His face was tense, fresh out of training, shipping off to Eastern Europe the next day. He hovered near the door, eyes landing on the plaque, then on Grace. She watched him for a moment, then waved him over. "Have a seat," she said. "That chair's always open for someone who doesn't quit." He bowed slightly, then walked over and sat down. Grace poured him a cup of coffee, then reached in her breast pocket and pulled out an old hand-sewn handkerchief, its edges carefully stitched, worn with age. It had belonged to a friend lost in Kandahar. "This was with me in Kandahar," she said. "Now, you take it with you." The young soldier received it with both hands, as if holding a legacy. The diner went quiet. Then, Master Sergeant Wilson raised his cup, a familiar gesture. This time, no one waited for a cue. Everyone, students, civilians, elderly veterans, rose and lifted their cups. A silent tribute, as moving as any anthem. Sunlight streamed through the window, casting a glow on the plaque. "Reserved for those who never back down." Grace gave a slight nod, her eyes misted but her voice solid as stone. "We don't need victory to deserve honor. We just need to never leave each other behind." In a world where the memory of those who served is too easily pushed behind city lights and breaking news, a small diner in Montana still holds fast to one truth. Honor doesn't require a medal ceremony, just someone who remembers your name. And here, no one is forgotten. No one is left behind. The story of Grace Donovan is not just a journey of one soldier reclaiming her honor. It is a profound wake-up call for how we, as a community, treat those who have quietly sacrificed to protect our way of life. In today's fast-paced world, where people rush past each other on streets, in supermarkets, or in quiet diners, we often fail to recognize that someone sitting silently nearby may carry invisible wounds, both physical and emotional, from standing on the front lines between life and death, so that the rest of us could live in peace. The image of Grace being insulted and knocked down while no one stepped in to defend her reflects a painful truth. Society can all too easily turn its back on those who once served it. And yet, the miracle lies in how a single act, a phone call from a witness, the silent rising of a veteran from the corner of a diner, can reignite a flame of dignity buried beneath shame. We are reminded that honor doesn't come from medals or rank, but from the respect and recognition given by community. Applied to our lives today, each of us has the power to be part of that change, not through titles or authority, but through small, human acts. Teaching a child to salute an aging veteran in the park. Saying hello to the quiet woman sitting alone in a clinic waiting room. Refusing to look away when injustice unfolds before us. These seemingly small moments, when carried out with genuine respect, can build the kind of society where no one is left behind. Grace's story reminds us that heroes walk among us every day, not looking for praise, just to be seen at the right moment in the right way. And in a world that so easily forgets, standing up for someone is not just an act of protection. It's a way of helping a community remember what matters most. Gratitude is never out of date. The final lesson? Be the one who stands up, even if it's just to say one true thing. Because you may be the reason someone believes that even when honor is trampled, there is still a path for it to rise again. Thank you so much for being here. Your support means everything, and I can't wait to bring you more heartfelt stories soon. Until next time, stay kind, stay inspired, and I'll see you in the next one.